I hope everybody had a wonderful summer and is back into our routine and getting ready for Yontif. This is a very exciting time for Torah in Motion. Tonight is the kickoff of our 10th year, a year full of great programs, inspiring speakers, you see here in the program in front of you. From our modest beginnings, we have become an internationally recognized organization known for its innovative and unique program. We have touched the lives of thousands in the four corners of the globe. We are proud of the range and diversity of our speakers, the differences of opinion, the nuance and complexity we try to bring to so many of our programs. Torah, as a reflection of life, is always in motion. And by combining the wisdom of our tradition and the best of modern life, we aim to bring insight and relevance into our lives. This summer, I had the pleasure of joining our first Torah in Motion journey through Jewish history. Our sold-out trip to Budapest, Vienna, Prague, Bratislava, another number of smaller towns and places away, and I see some of our participants are here in the audience, really brought Jewish history to life in a way that it has never come to life before for me. Being a link in the beautiful chain of Jewish history is what motivates me and all of us in the work that we do, all of us in Torah in Motion. We look forward to seeing you often at our wonderful programs and what promises to be a great year. Please God, right after Yontif, we'll be launching our new website, which will offer many more opportunities for learning, our Divrei Torah articles, our online classes, our live online classes, interviews. So join the over 5,500 people who are on our weekly email list and thousands who log into Torah in Motion. Our sages teach that at 120 years, the first question God will ask is whether we have conducted our business affairs, our monetary affairs in faith. Judaism at the core is a way of life that expects and demands ethical excellence. As we prepare for the Day of Judgment, it is a pleasure to host our first program of the year on the topic of ethics, how to be good, ethics in our daily living, with one of our foremost thinkers and writers on the topics of ethics. I'm going to turn over the program to Elliot, who'll do the official introduction, and I just want to wish everybody a k'tiva v'chatima tova, a good year, a meaningful year, and an inspiring year. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to personally thank my friends and students, Hamini and Rosmarin, for their generous support of the evening, as well as Esther Luft-Schwartz, who is co-sponsored in memory of her beloved husband, Marcus, Zichron Livracha. May Marcus's neshama have an aliyah, and may you, Esther, and your entire family be spared any more sorrow. It's really a pleasure for me to be finally sitting down and talking with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin this evening. Rabbi Telushkin is a pioneer in the field of contemporary Jewish ethics and has, over the past 30 years, created an enduring legacy of books that should hold a prominent place in every family's library. He's the author of Jewish Literacy, the most important things to know about the Jewish religion, its people, and its history, which is the most widely selling book on Judaism of the past 2 decades. In the 1980s, he co-authored 2 books with his childhood friend Dennis Prager, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, and Why the Jews. Among his other works are Jewish Wisdom, Biblical Literacy, Jewish Humor, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, and A Code of Jewish Ethics, You Shall Be Holy. In September 2010, he published Hillel, If Not Now, When, a biography of the great Talmudic sage, which makes the argument as to why Hillel should emerge as the great rabbinic figure of the 21st century. Rabbi Telushkin is currently writing a book, In Search of the Rebbe, which is a study of the life and impact of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Rabbi Telushkin was ordained at Yeshiva University in New York and pursued graduate studies in Jewish history at Columbia. He resides in Manhattan with his wife Devorah and their 4 children. He lectures throughout the United States. He serves as a senior associate at Klal, on the board of directors of the Jewish Book Council, and he's the spiritual leader of the Synagogue for the Performing Arts in Los Angeles. I first met Rabbi Telushkin in 1998 when I interviewed him in his Manhattan apartment for a television series I had created called Judaism: A Quest for Meaning, which played on Canadian and US television for about 30 seconds. And since then, we've attempted a follow-up, and I'm pleased to say that it has only taken us 13 years. Please welcome Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. Thank you. I'd like to begin, if you could please describe your upbringing in terms of religion. How would you depict your parents' relationship to Judaism? And do you remember differences in the kind of Jewish elements that were transmitted to you by your mother as opposed to your father, or vice versa?
My father, by orientation, and I mean by emotional predisposition, is a chassid, and my mother, by emotional predisposition, was a classic misnagid. She had a rationalist mind. My father was by nature an optimist. My mother, she would describe herself as a realist. I remember something my mother once said, which my friend Dennis Prager has popularized. She once said, "The only people I know who are happy are people I don't know well." Which she used to repeat until one day I said it to someone, and the person said, "Does that mean that when people come to know your mother well, they're no longer happy?" So, she also said on another occasion, she says, "When it's not terrible to be a Jew, it's wonderful." My father's faith, my father was a more God-oriented person. My mother wasn't. My father comes from a distinguished line of rabbis and rabbinical scholars. My mother came, from a family that was not as much the case, and she became more observant when she married my father. My father was, though, more God-oriented, too. And, I would remember my father, he was not punctilious about going to minyan in the morning. He would daven at home. But I remember at one point, my father was an accountant. And at one point, my grandfather, who was a distinguished Talmid Chacham, was concerned that my father wouldn't continue his learning. So he said to my father, as a minimum every day, study 2 Mishnayos after you daven. I mean, it turns out my father did a lot more than that. He gave a weekly shiur and Talmud. But my father was by nature a very orderly person. I tend to be more in like spurts and do things. But I remember he then would never miss. And he had a rationalist mind. I remember when I was about 18, when you grow up in an Orthodox environment, you often have very little exposure to non-Orthodox Jews, particularly growing up where I grew up in Brooklyn. And I remember I met a Reconstructionist rabbi, which was not that common in my experiences in those days. And I remember he was a pretty observant fellow, this rabbi, but he told me, he said, "I'll give you an example of how I'm different." He had been raised Orthodox. He said, "I put on tefillin every morning, but if an emergency comes up and I don't put on tefillin, I don't feel guilty about it," which struck me as a sensible attitude. I mentioned it to my father, and my father said, "I agree. If an emergency comes up and I don't put on tefillin, I don't feel guilty about it." But he said, until today, such an emergency has never come up. So, and his point was, if you define it in advance, such emergencies might emerge. So that was sort of the household in which I grew up. But it was a very open household. My grandfather, most of my grandfather's family they all came from Russia, and they had been influenced. Thank God, none of them had ever become communists, but they had, they were attracted to organizations like the Bund, and they had become quite non-observant. And my grandfather always made a point of making sure everybody came to us for the Seder. So we used to have these giant Siddurim, and it was very, very important to the identity of these people who did not feel close at that point to Judaism as a religion, but who had that familial closeness with my grandfather, and that kept them very much within the family and within Judaism.
I know that your father had a connection. You're working on a book on the Rebbe. I know your father had a connection with the Rebbe. He was an accountant, and he worked until he suffered a stroke. Maybe you can tell us about his accounting connection with the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
Yes, well, Lubavitch became a presence in American Jewish life in 1940, when the sixth Rebbe, who's known as the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, came to the United States. And my father then had started practicing accounting, and so he became the accountant, and he was the accountant for the movement as it was growing, starting from then until he had a stroke in 1986 when he was 80. And my father had gradually given up all of his other accounts, but he always wanted to keep this one going. And as I've done research on the life of the Rebbe, I've been struck by the fact the Rebbe vigorously always discouraged people from retiring. He did not think people should retire. In any case, my father in 1986 had a stroke. I was living in Israel at the time, and my mother called me and told me I should come home immediately, which I did, and my father was for 5 days after the stroke unconscious, and he was in the ICU. And then during that time, every day we got 2 calls from the Rebbe's office, usually from Rabbi Krinsky, how is my father? And then my father came out of his unconscious state, and he was speaking, but his mind was inconsistent. It was sometimes jumbled. And one day I get a call. I take the call from Rabbi Krinsky, and he says, the Rebbe has an accounting question for your father. And I said, Rabbi Krinsky, you know how sick my father is. He said, we know there was a meeting this morning, of the leadership, and an accounting question arose, and the Rebbe said, ask Shlomo. So at that point, of course, I went and asked my father, and it turned out to be a question that my father was able to answer. The story was profoundly moving to me, because I realized what happened was there was the Rebbe in his office in Brooklyn. He was an exceedingly busy man. He was basically supervising the world of Chabad, which was an international movement, and he obviously put himself into the mindset of my father, who was there. My father was like a person who was running full speed and suddenly runs into a wall. That's what had happened to him. He was still working as an accountant, he was still giving his weekly share, and then he had a stroke, and suddenly everything is taken from him in that regard. And the Rebbe obviously put himself into that situation and realized what my father must be feeling like. And by asking him a question that my father could then answer, it gave my father a renewed sense that there was still a mission for him. And I've told that story in the years afterwards, and I ended up writing about it. And, that's probably the origin of how I came to now be working on this book. It was a very, very important story in our family. And in general, there are a lot of miracle stories, obviously, that circulate in Chabad about the Rebbe. And it's hard. You try and track them down, and many of them are told anonymously, and you don't. But I find myself, and there are some that obviously do suggest superhuman powers. I think the Rebbe did seem to have an ability to channel, which is that he knew things that we don't know. The knowledge was coming to him from somewhere. But I'm also profoundly moved by different types of stories. A story my father told me that happened in the 1950s, where a friend of my father's had a brother who was living in Israel who became extremely ill. It was a very, very terrible illness. And my father saw the man look pale, and he suggested that he go speak to the Rebbe, and this was in the 50s when it was much easier to get access to the Rebbe. And the man felt, what's the Rebbe going to be able to tell me? What's the Rebbe going to be able to do? But my father urged him, he did go to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him many questions about his brother's illness. And then the Rebbe said, there was a doctor so-and-so who could treat it. And the man said, we know about that doctor. My brother's at a hospital that's a far distance from his hospital, and he won't come. And my brother's too sick to be moved. So the Rebbe ended up giving the man a bracha, and he left. He found out that later that night, that doctor showed up at the hospital, performed an operation, and refused any payment for it. And that story always struck me also as when you use the nicest thing, if you ever speak to people who have managed to gain some prominence in their lives, the nicest feeling you can have from it is you have an increased ability to do good. And the Rebbe is, an example of how that created what, from this family's perspective, was a miracle. The doctor they needed to save the brother's life showed up and didn't want to take payment and did the operation. It was a success.
Let's go back a bit to your childhood. Grew up a Jewish child in New York City,
Right.
in the 1950s. I'm wondering about, in terms of how you thought about Judaism and religious matters as a child. Were you curious about God? Did faith come easily? If so, where did that emerge from for you? Did it develop later on?
In my case, the issues of faith in God did develop later on. I was less God-oriented when I was younger. First of all, you always run the risk that you can find if you grow up in a basically halachic environment, it's often not that God-oriented. My father, it so happens, was, but I was more study-oriented, and it wasn't as much. And studying on my own, I was actually a very poor student in school. My closest friend from the yeshiva of Flatbush, where we both attended, was Dennis Prager. And we were in a class that had 110 students. And I was graduated 83rd, and Dennis graduated 92nd. Now, it was for a reason, which I'm not necessarily proud of, I'm not embarrassed of either. I tended only to study what I was already interested in. I mean, I'm a little embarrassed because as a result I have an abysmally poor knowledge of the sciences, which I didn't have an innate interest in. But what always, and I was a bit of an autodidact. I didn't, by and large, my friendship with Dennis was the most profound. It was a very profound intellectual influence. My relationship with my grandfather was a very profound influence on me. And what was interesting was my grandfather never spoke English well. He came over to the United States as a rabbi in 1924. He had a congregation that wanted him to stick, for which he spoke in Yiddish. And he had a good reading knowledge of English, but he had a very thick accent, so he was not comfortable speaking in it. And as a result, and I never acquired a knowledge of Yiddish, which I'm unhappy about, particularly now that I'm working on a book on the Rebbe. So we spoke in Hebrew. So my relationship with my grandfather was in Hebrew, but I would learn with him. So I mean, that was a very, very important influence, and my father was. But my friendship with Dennis really is what brought us into the world where we wanted to start trying to affect a broader world.
You met in the 10th grade, I think?
We met yes. I feel like this man knows my life very well. I can't make up stories here. Not that I was planning to. But yes, Dennis and I, as I mentioned, we were both not good students, and significantly enough, we met walking to a bookstore that was near the school because we both pursued reading of things on our own. And what Dennis gave me was, Dennis saw himself in more grandiose terms. And, I came from a much more,
Attractive.
Yeah, a family that my father and mother both were people who really had great humility. And Dennis sort of saw himself as a young age, that he'll probably become a senator, and he was a very public figure, and he pushed me to become more public. Dennis and I used to joke about, because we wrote 2 books together, and we used to joke that had Dennis written the book alone, it would have been 30 pages, just written in outline form, making 30 different points, and if I wrote it, it would have been like 200 anecdotes in search of a thesis. Because, and so I would push him because he would start out with very large generalizations, and I'd push him to get what could we extract from it that would be legitimate, and he would push me to think in bigger terms so that my thoughts would affect the bigger world. What had happened was, Dennis and I had both at early ages become very involved in the movement for Soviet Jewry. And in those days, as you know, it was a renaissance was starting in the Soviet Union among Jews that was deeply impacted by the Six-Day War. And in '67, when the Six-Day War occurred, Russia broke diplomatic relations with Israel. So prior to '67, basically Israel kept abreast of Soviet Jewry. They would always overpopulate the Israeli embassy in Russia, and there would be people who were basically assigned to try and, within the limits of what you could do in a totalitarian society, to try and stay abreast of what was going on. They broke relations in in 67. And so then they started sending American Jews in. For many years, American, Canadian Jews, for many years this was a story that couldn't be told, because if any of us had been arrested while we were in Russia and it came out that we had been sent by the Israelis, this would have been a serious criminal offense, not a minor criminal offense. So we both got very influenced through experiences that we had had. And, but then we used to go around giving a lot of talks about it. And then I remember Dennis once came back and said to me, he says, whatever groups we speak to, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Federation, Hadassah, the same sorts of questions keep coming up. You have to believe in God to be a good Jew. Why do we need organized religion? Isn't being an ethical person enough? If Judaism is supposed to make people better, how do you account for unethical religious Jews? How does Judaism differ from other value systems, from Christianity, from Marxism? What's the Jewish role in the world? Questions like that. And again, Dennis, in his typical fashion, said, you know what, we'll sit down together over a weekend and we'll write it. Remember, weekend, you're excluding Shabbat. So it meant we basically write it from Friday morning and then starting again Saturday night. And he saw it as a pamphlet, but it evolved into our first book, which was called 8 Questions People Ask About Judaism. We later expanded it. And now I realize we were 24 at the time when we started doing it. When you're that age, you don't think of yourself as being particularly young. But I see adults would react to it like, this is, very young. But that's basically our career evolved out of that.
So you said that Dennis had aspirations to be a senator. Did you have aspirations to be a rabbi?
I had long assumed, Dennis reminds me that in high school they used to call me rabbi. I had long assumed that I was going to want to get smicha because I knew I had some ideas about Judaism that, in some ways would be a little distinctive, and I wanted to get a hearing for them. In other words, if you're going into the world, if you want to write books that will influence people in the world of academia, you need to have that PhD. Because without it, if you have a thesis that's at all revolutionary, you're not going to be taken seriously. You have to establish some level of credentials. So I knew I wanted to have the learning. It was not just to have the degree. I wanted to actually have the experience, of the learning to do it. Now, I wanted to be a writer from an early age. But the truth is, when you're in high school and you want to be a writer, you're usually thinking in terms of fiction. So that's what I originally thought, but then gradually I knew that I had ideas about Judaism that I wanted to express, and that's in a sense how it evolved. So I got smicha, and then I assumed I'd get my PhD, and I passed my orals at Columbia in history, but I ended up not writing my dissertation because by then I had started doing more popular writing, and the killer is when you start doing more popular writing, it's hard to get back to dissertation writing.
You're writing, we should talk about that. It really does not shy away from a big scope. That's the first thing that I'm struck by, that you've tackled everything from the origins and reasons for anti-Semitism and why the Jews, to books that read almost like a primary course in basic yet sophisticated Judaism. When you read Jewish literacy or Jewish wisdom and biblical literacy, and these books actually had a big impact in my own life, it seemed to me that as I read those books going back now 20 years, that they weren't simply just compilations of information. It wasn't just a how-to or why-to about Judaism, but that they were actually part of a kind of a project that was responding to specific developments in Judaism: assimilation, intermarriage, disaffection. So I'm wondering, do you feel when you were writing it that you were actually responding to a fundamental need, that there was nothing out there that could give Jews the information they needed?
I certainly felt that Dennis and I felt that when we wrote 9 Questions, that we wanted to write in a sense, these are questions people are answering, and we wanted to give answers. In Why the Jews, we felt that there was a misunderstanding of anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism was attributed to factors other than the people's Jewishness. That, for example, how many of you at some point in your life heard it said that Jews were hated in the medieval period because they were money lenders? It's a very common thing. Now, the truth is, first of all, is that accurate? And the answer is yes. A disproportionate percentage of money lenders were Jews. Second, did people hate money lenders? The answer is, not surprisingly, yes. The average rate of interest on a loan in 13th century France was something like 40% per annum. So you can imagine what people felt. But in order to assume that that's why Jews were hated, you would have to assume that Jews were well-integrated members of European society. Then they got together, whatever was the ancient equivalent of the medieval Jewish Federation, and they said the real money to be made is in money lending. Let's become money lenders, whereupon anti-Semitism erupted. Now, of course, that's absurd. Jews were hated. Because they were hated, they were forbidden to practice other professions. They ended up getting forced into money lending. Once they became money lenders, it exacerbated, but it didn't cause anti-Semitism. And we thought that it was important to start trying to communicate that idea, because Sartre wrote what was at that time regarded as a leading study of anti-Semitism called Anti-Semite and Jew, in which he basically says anything Jewish that anti-Semites say about Jews is the figment of their own imagination. But Judaism had a challenge to it. We challenged the world, and in those societies where our challenge was greater, we were more hated. Judaism stands on God, law, and peoplehood. In a society like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, these were atheist societies. So the Jewish belief in God was not accepted. Judaism believed in law. In totalitarian societies where law was identified with the leader and there was no one above him. The whole idea of Torah is that no matter how exalted a person is, there's a law above him. And Judaism believes in peoplehood. What did the Nazis believe in? They believed in Aryan superiority. In societies, for example, I write of the United States where I live, America's God-oriented but not Jesus-oriented. Every American president speaks of God in his inaugural address. They don't speak about Jesus. America's a law-oriented society. For all that America, the United States, is often thought of as being a Christian country, and in some ways it is, in the American obsession almost with law, it has a lot akin to Judaism. And America is a nation largely comprised of immigrants. So it's not surprising that on those fundamental levels there isn't a Jewish conflict with it. Jewish literacy was, I realized too many Jews knew too little, and I wanted to break Judaism down into smaller 2 or 3 page chapters that people could come to an understanding. I'll tell you, I rarely speak about this, but I wrote the book in an odd way. I was on a committee with the Wexner Foundation that was supposed to come up with a basic vocabulary. What do you need to know something about Judaism? And we comprised lists. There were 4 of us on the committee: Herb Friedman, who was the president of the foundation, Nathan Laufer, who was the vice president, Reuven Kimmelman, who was a professor of Talmud at Brandeis, and me. And we met for 8 days, arguing for 7 hours a day, or 7 days for 8 hours a day, arguing what terms you need. And we came up with a list. What do you need to know to make you Jewishly literate? What terms do you need to be literate? It meant that you could use the term or hear the term without understanding the ramifications. If I say something about the Dreyfus trial, and you're Jewishly literate, so to speak, so you know this was a famous anti-Semitic trial that took place in France and had a very big effect. Herzl was influenced by it to start Zionism. And so I told them right off the bat, I want to write a book based on it. And I actually I had been reading about almost all of these subjects for much of my life. I was 40 at the time, so probably for the last 25 years. And I wrote the book out of my head. In other words, I imagined as I wrote each of the sections, and I couldn't do it with every one, but with most of them, I imagined as I wrote each of the sections, somebody asked me at a lecture, what is the significance of the Dreyfus trial in Jewish life, or any such term. And the reason I wanted to write the first draft out of my head was because I figured if I would convey what made this memorable to me, it would be apt to make it memorable to other people. If I wrote it like an encyclopedia, even though the book was encyclopedic in scope, what would end up happening is everything would be very balanced. There wouldn't be passion in the book. And so I wanted to do that. And then obviously once I wrote it, I would go back and check. Memories are not perfect. There would be errors. There might be an important thing that I left out. But that was my goal. I wanted to do it. And all of my work since then has basically evolved along those lines.
I mean, your work has begun to focus more and more on the ethical. You've lamented the idea that so many people equate Judaism with ritual observance, that when people discuss a person's religiosity, when they say, oh, so-and-so is religious, that they're speaking basically about their kashrut or their Shabbat observance, as though ethics were a kind of extracurricular activity, I think is the way you put it. Now, you've stated that ethics is at the center. So I'd like you to explain exactly what you mean by that, and also, if it is at the center, how is it that in contemporary Judaism we seem to have moved a bit off-center, as it were?
I think there are a few reasons, and what you said cuts to the core of the problem. Ideally, obviously, we assume that if a person is religious, they're also going to be ethical. But it doesn't play a role, as you noted, in our defining a religious person. So if two Jews are speaking about a third, a not uncommon occurrence in Jewish life, and the question is raised, is so-and-so religious? The answer, yes or no, is going to be based only on ritual observance. He keeps Shabbos, he keeps kosher, he doesn't. Now, first of all, I say this as a Jew who passionately believes in ritual for a few reasons. Without ritual, we don't have holiness. Anybody here who ever experiences a Shabbat knows that the sense of the sacred of the Shabbat derives from the rituals. I was speaking this morning to the high school seniors at Chat, and I gave as an example, I'll offer it here. How many of you, according to Jewish law, as I assume many of us here know, the Sabbath is inaugurated with the lighting of 2 candles. And how many of your families do you light an additional candle for each child in the family? Okay, significant percentage. I grew up in such a household. And I mentioned that a friend of mine, a very distinguished figure, Abraham Twersky, who's a Hasidic Rebbe and a psychiatrist who grew up in Milwaukee, told me that he grew up in a household where his parents lit an additional candle for each child. And he said how wonderful it was for him to know, even as a child, that because he was born, every Shabbat there was more light in his parents' household. And what Twersky, of course, was speaking about there was the capacity of halacha to also speak the language of poetry. That's a way that they convey love. Now, without ritual laws, we wouldn't have Jewish continuity. You know, over 3,000 years ago, we were liberated from slavery in Egypt. Michael Walzer, the political theorist at Princeton, has argued that the story of the Exodus from Egypt has influenced more movements of social change and transformation than any other story in any literature. But if we Jews didn't commemorate that event every year in the Seder, that story would still influence people, but the Jewish people would no longer exist. So without ritual, we won't have the continuity of the Jewish people. I'll give you an example I often cite in the United States, and I should figure out what the Canadian equivalent of it is. If I'll ask Americans, when was George Washington's birthday? Americans over 50 will say February 22nd, and Lincoln's February 12th. Younger Americans don't know it, because about 30 years ago, they created what was called President's Day. It's the third Monday in February that's intended to honor all presidents, but ends up honoring none. And I always say, can you imagine if a group of rabbis got together and said, how can we increase attendance in Shul on Yom Kippur? And somebody said, yeah, let's make Yom Kippur the first Sunday in October. What would happen? I predict attendance would drop drastically because the power of a ritual is that you have to adjust your life to the ritual. The moment the ritual can be changed just because it's inconvenient, what you're stating is that the ritual has no intrinsic significance. Part of the power of Jewish holidays is that in 3,000 years they've never arrived on time. Every year the holidays are early this year, the holidays are late this year, but they never arrive on time. And ritual has the power to teach ethical lessons. When I was growing up in Brooklyn in the 1950s, you did not have nearly as much rabbinical supervision of products as there is now today. Basically today you can travel pretty much, I know in the United States, I don't know if it's the same here, but I know in the United States you can pretty much travel anywhere in the country and go into a large supermarket and an enormous number of products have the the OU, and other kashrut symbols. But when I was a kid, if you kept kosher, obviously you were very punctilious about the butcher, where you bought your meat. And when it came to dairy products, most people, not in all communities, Chabad, for example, was always very strict about Chalav Yisrael, kosher milk, but if you weren't makpid, if you weren't careful about that, most people read ingredients. My friend, Dennis Prager, said, when I was 6 years old, the first words I learned to read in English were pure vegetable shortening only. He said it was a good thing to learn at the age of 6 that I couldn't have every candy bar in the candy store. And yet, though, the ethical imperative became very, very important and got overlooked. People forget the story in the Talmud. They remember the story, but they forget the underlying premise of it. When a non-Jew approaches Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, in the 1st century before the Common Era, and says to him, teach me Judaism while I'm standing on one foot. So Hillel doesn't answer him about Shabbat, he doesn't answer him about God. He says, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbors. Ekol Torah kula, this is the whole Torah. Idach Perusha, the rest is commentary. Zil Gemar, now go and study. And according to the Talmud, the implication of the Talmudic text is that he then converts him and continues studying with him. So I wanted to create influence of Judaism that's very focused also on study, because the idea is that study will cause people to keep on growing. But Hillel obviously saw this central role for ethics. I'll tell you another misnomer that often happens. What does the word mitzvah mean? Just call out an answer. Okay, the first answer that was called out was good deed. The second answer was commandment. The truth is, in Hebrew, mitzvah means commandment, and in Yiddish, it has the connotation of good deed. The difference between good deed and commandment, though subtle, is significant. Commandment is something obligatory, and good deed is something voluntary. So let me compare two types of diets. If this group is a normal cross-section of contemporary people, many of us have occasion to diet. How many of you have dieted at some point within the last 5 years? How many of you have gone on a diet? How many of you never diet? You're the people who caused me to violate the 10th commandment against coveting. And covet you the ability to eat as much ice cream as you want. Okay. But those of you who do diet, how many of you have ever kept a diet for 3 months or longer without breaking it once? How many of you have broken it inside of 3 weeks? Inside of 3 hours? Okay. Compare that with the diet of people who keep kosher. Now, the motives for regular dieting are very powerful. People diet for 2 reasons: to be physically more attractive and healthier. It would seem to be an irresistible combination, and yet almost all of us break our diets. Compare that with the diet known as kashrut. There is no evidence that keeping kosher will make you physically more attractive or healthier. I have never had the experience of seeing somebody walk into a room and I say to them, you look fantastic, you must have lost 40 pounds, what happened? Oh, I started keeping kosher. Nobody has ever lost weight on Shabbos, except when Shabbos coincided with Yom Kippur. You know, because look at the foods. You have cholent, you have challah, you know, all of those foods. And yet, think about it. If I was at a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, and I was about to eat a piece of chocolate cake, and somebody came running up to me and said, Joseph, don't eat that cake. You'll look better, you'll feel better. I'll think, when is this nudnik going to go away so I can eat this cake? But if somebody ran up and said to me, Joseph, don't eat that cake, some pork fell into the mix, I dropped the plate in horror. I have conjectured that if the American government mandated they had to put pork into chocolate products, I could lose 30 pounds. Because when you do something out of a sense of obligation, you do it with greater consistency. And that's why the notion of mitzvah as commandment is a distinctive Jewish notion and a very, very important one. The nature of commandment, because it inculcates certain forms of consistency. And I became fascinated with it in a whole host of ways. I remember reading an article. Can I go on? Okay. No, I know you have more questions. Okay, I'll give you something I once came across in something Abraham Tversky wrote. What is the Jewish attitude? This is not what Tversky had, but it's what occurred to me. What is the Jewish attitude towards pigs? Most Jews assume Judaism has a very negative attitude of pigs, which when you think about it is stupid, because if you were a pig, you would love Judaism. Chickens and cows do not like Judaism. So most Jews think that they're supposed to have a very negative attitude towards pig. And then Tversky reminded me of a Sifra, which is one of the ancient rabbinic sources, which says a Jew is not supposed to say, I don't want to eat pig, I hate pig. He's supposed to say, I would like to eat pig, but what could I do? God has forbidden it. In other words, the rabbi saw kashrut as being a training in self-discipline. But then, this was the innovative point Telushkin made. He said, but think about it. Most Jews today, if they were raised in a strictly kosher home, are not usually tempted to eat pig. You know, if I ate something and found out later that I had pork, I once had occasion to eat something. It wasn't even that. It was, I had a hot dog, and then somebody gave me a potato chip, and I ate the potato chip, and it tasted funny, and then I looked at the bag, and it come from a bag. This was not done maliciously, but the bag said cheddar cheese potato chips, and I immediately, okay, I don't have to spell it out. You know, I threw up. I got sick from it. So he said, kashrut still has to be kept because it's a law in the Torah, but it might not have the same ability as it did in the past to teach self-discipline. But what law does? The laws concerning Lashon Hara. The laws concerning Lashon Hara, there's probably no area in which we so fundamentally and systematically violate the golden rule to do unto others as you'd have others do unto you. Because think about it. If you started to walk into a room and you heard the people in the room talking about you, what would you least like to hear them talking about? Anybody have any thoughts? What would you least like to hear them talking about? What aspects of your life? I think most of us, what we least like to hear people talking about are our character flaws and the intimate details of our social life. When we gossip about other people, what are we most apt to gossip about? Their character flaws and the intimate details of their social life. Happens to be very interesting to most of us. It's not a nice feature, but it is. So can you imagine, now, this I thought about. At which meal during the week is the most Lashon Hara usually spoken? Friday night. Why? It's not because people say, I'm saving this up for the Shabbos table to speak Lashon Hara. It's because it's the most relaxed night of the week. In fact, studies show there is actually, which is the month in the year when the least Lashon Hara is spoken? Tishrei, because Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That's a nice thought. I hope it's true. I don't think it is. The month in which the least Lashon Hara is spoken is February. And in leap years, more Lashon Hara is spoken. No, I'm making the point because it's only 28 days. You know, that's the point. You know, people really do it. So can you imagine if somebody at the Shabbat table, when gossip started, said, you know what? I love to talk about other people's character flaws, and I find it fascinating to hear the intimate details of other people's social life, but what could I do? It's forbidden. You know, that would really be a law in which we could again develop a sense really of self-discipline. And that's what something could do, because there's an innovative, and then I'll give you, okay, there's an innovative aspect. Let me ask a question here, but this time I really do need people to try and answer. What does Lashon Hara mean? Explain it in English. What is Lashon Hara? Gossip? A malicious gossip, or as a rabbinic friend of mine in New York puts it, mean-spirited, yeah. Okay, yes, literally it means evil speech, but what constitutes, what is evil speech? What speech does it refer to? Gossip. Okay, let me ask you a question. Is Lashon Hara true? Truthful speech. No, it's not that it can be. It is true. Lashon Hara by definition is true. If it's false, it's even worse. It's what's called motzi shemra. It's giving someone a bad name. But the brilliant, innovative insight of Judaism is that it is, by definition, true. That, my friend Izzy Stein, who's a rabbi in Connecticut, that's what he said. It's a mean-spirited truth. Now, what is the reason for that? And I'll tell you what it is. How many of you, by a showing of hands, could think of at least one incident in your life that you would be embarrassed if it became known to everybody else in this room? Okay. Those of you who are not raising your hands, I suspect, are either lying, have very boring lives, or have bad memories. You know, we can all think of things in our life. And the truth is, when I think of certain things in my life, I really don't want you to know, but when you raise your hands, I was thinking, gee, I wonder what they're concealing. You know, so the truth is, the fact that it's true is not a defense against the charge of Lashon Hara. Not everything that we know about other people is anybody else's rights. I know that in the society in which I live in the United States, I remember here, I'll tell you, I have 2 recollections from a time when I was much younger, which shows, a naivete, but I actually remember how I felt when it happened. One was the recollection when the American Supreme Court passed a decision known as Roe v. Wade, which made abortions legal. And I remember thinking, on that day, there will be no more children in the United States born out of wedlock. First of all, nobody under the age of 50 even knows what that means, out of wedlock. Because when I was a kid, it was considered so shameful for a woman who was not married to be pregnant that if abortion was permitted, I assumed all women would get abortions. At the time Roe v. Wade passed, something like 2.5% of births in America were to women who were not married. It's now about 25%. Because the lesson that was learned from Roe v. Wade was that women have a right to do what they want with their bodies. They don't, so it was different. And I remember when the Watergate scandal caused Nixon to resign, I remember the thought I had, no more scoundrels will ever go into politics. Because it seemed that, you would be so investigated, nobody would do it. And yet we saw that it didn't really end up having that effect, so we don't know what it is. I think what ends up happening, though, is all of us who raised our hands and could think of some incident we'd be embarrassed about, and how many of your cases would fear of that becoming public knowledge? You don't have to raise your hands because you're sitting here with your spouse, you don't want to make them suspicious. But and how many of your cases with fear of every aspect of your life being made public knowledge alone cause you to not want to go into public life? There was a scandal years ago when Clarence Thomas was nominated to the American Supreme Court, and I'm really sorry, if I knew these things would come up, I wouldn't want to give examples that would more strike home here. But whatever you think of Thomas, it was known, because this was a liberal conservative divide and incensed many people, it was known that there were about 100 people going around, or 10 people, 20 people on the anti-Thomas forces, asking people who knew Thomas, can you tell us anything scandalous about him? How would you like? Imagine if you applied for a position somewhere as a rabbi, and you found out that the people supporting the other candidate were trying to go to anybody who ever knew you, anybody who might have ever had. I didn't get married till I was 39. I am sure that there are some women who have nasty things to say about me. If you went to everybody who ever knew you and said, do you know anything bad about him? Do you know, it happened, there was a Jewish guy who was nominated for the American Supreme Court. And he was a conservative. He had a former girlfriend who had become very liberal, and she let loose the news that he had smoked pot with her consistently. So then all of a sudden they started saying, this will give a whole new meaning to the term high court. But in any case, so it cheapens, so it's a terrible thing. The scourge of Lashon Hara is a terrible one, which is why I ended up writing a whole book on it, because of how damaging it could be.
I mean, you're talking about...
I will now give shorter answers.
Talking about scoundrels, something you mentioned in the wake of the Bernie Madoff scandal is that Jewish ethical lapses are actually old news. It's nothing new, and that, Rabbi Kelman noted, and you've noted before, that the first question that they ask you up in heaven is, were you honest in your business dealings? What would you say is Judaism's actual outlook on human nature?
I'll say something first about business and then on human nature. It's fascinating that that's considered to be the first question. Nasata v'natata b'emunah. And I'll tell you why I find it so fascinating. Years ago, I wrote a book on Jewish humor, called Jewish Humor, which was an attempt to explain Jewish life through about 200 jokes. It actually is a funny book, because when you hear a book is about humor, it can become ponderous. But I wanted the book to be funny, but also insightful. One of the reasons ethnic humor became controversial is because it paints with very broad strokes. In ethnic humor, there were no individuals, there was only groups. For example, I know this is true in the United States, I'm not sure here. If a joke starts out about drinking, which ethnic group is it usually attributed to? The Irish. In the United States, it's the Irish, and they get it. If a joke starts out about Italians, what does the joke tend to be about? The mafia. Rodney Dangerfield said, I used to work in an Italian nightclub that was so tough, on the menu they had broken leg of lamb. Where do Jews get it in humor? in two areas, both having to do with money. One I don't understand and one I do. The one I don't understand is there are a lot of jokes about Jews being cheap. I actually don't think that's a common characteristic. I don't think when a Jewish couple walk into a restaurant, waiters assume that they will not be tipped or will be given a low tip. I think if anything, Jews tend to usually be a fairly generous group. But the other are about Jews as tricksters. And this I find fascinating. In Hebrew, there is no greater compliment that you can give a person than to say he is a chacham. In Yiddish, the word chacham has the connotation of trickster. I have for years gone around giving a speech on Jewish humor, and it sometimes, not often, it sometimes has happened that I've had occasion to give it before either non-Jewish groups or before groups that have many non-Jews in them, and I'll be asked, do you give the same speech? People have asked me, do you give the same speech on humor before a non-Jewish group as before a Jewish one? And I said, yes, it's almost the exact same speech, but there's one joke I only tell in front of a Jewish audience. And it's a joke, two Jewish businessmen run into each other on the street. One says, I heard your business burned down last night. And the other one says, shh, tomorrow night. Now, significantly, Jews obviously wrote that joke, and Jews laugh at that joke, and our laughter is significant, and I'll tell you why. If you hear of a Jewish couple who don't care whether their son or daughter continues their education beyond high school, we're shocked. There are such Jewish parents, but our image of ourselves is that we're more committed to education than other groups. If you hear of a Jewish man who divorces his wife and subsequent to the divorce has no contact with his children, we're shocked. There are such Jewish men, but our image of ourselves as Jews is that we're as committed or more committed than other groups to family. If we hear of a Jew who commits a white-collar crime, we're not shocked, we're embarrassed. In our own self-image, we're not more honest. I'm not saying we're less honest, but we're no better. And it's fascinating that 2,000 years ago, that was the first question the Talmud thought to ask, because it was probably a problem then too. So that was what was so significant. And then there was a part two to your question.
Well, really what your answer is making me think of is children. It's making me think of the influence of all of this when our kids look around and they see the sorts of ethical examples that we have. So I'm wondering if you were to address a Jewish parent out there, what do you think that parents can do to raise sort of more spiritually and ethically sensitive children? And if you could give a practical example of how that would work.
Yeah, in a whole variety of ways. Look, I know kids whose parents would tell them to lie about their age in places where such a lie, they could get in more cheaply somewhere and not realizing, how potentially damaging that was. There's a teaching in the Gemara Sukkah, which has nothing to do, as you know, if any of you have ever studied the Talmud, you know that if a tractate is called Shabbat, there will be a lot about Shabbat in it, but it's also, there's a stream of consciousness, so other elements come in. So I'm going to give you the beginning of a quote in the Gemara, and then I'm going to ask people, if you're familiar with it, obviously don't ruin what I'm trying to do and finish the quote. But if you aren't familiar with the quote, tell me how you think the quote will finish. The Gemara starts, a parent should never promise to give a child something and then not give it to him because... Okay, anybody want to take a guess at how it concludes? Yes? Right, the child will no longer trust the parent. Anything else? I think that's the first instinct most of us would have today, and that's a very legitimate instinct. But the Gemara's is even more, in my view, even a little more interesting, because from that the child will learn that it is okay to be a badai. It is okay to be a liar. Because it understands. What they'll learn from that is the parent is indicating to them, you don't have to carry out what you say. And that's going to be a very powerful lesson that you don't have to do it. Years ago, when my book of Jewish values came out, so a large television special was done based on the book called Moral Imagination. And I picked about 10 or 12 lessons from Jewish ethics that I wanted to emphasize. And Mary Beth Rogers, who was the woman who was the producer of it, who was not Jewish, she said, please, Joseph, just make sure that you pick examples that are as relevant to non-Jews as Jews. And I said, Bess, you know what? All of my ethical examples are. These are things I think Judaism can teach to to the broader world. They all apply as much. I said, but it is one lesson. If I could communicate this and people would remember this, I think it was near the Pesach, so I said, Dayanim, this would be enough for me. And that's one simple change I'd like to see introduced into American life, into Canadian life, which I feel would have the capacity to start transforming the society immediately, and within a matter of years transform the society tremendously. And that would be if parents would reserve the highest praise of their children for when their children acted morally and compassionately. Because children generally get their highest praise for one of four things: for their academic achievements, for their athletic accomplishments, for their cultural achievements, like great musical abilities, and in the case of girls, for their looks. A child who gets his or her great compliments in these areas is happy. We all need all the compliments we can get. But there's also, to some extent, a feeling that parental love is somewhat conditional on their performing well in these areas. And as a rule, when you hear a parent say, oh, but so-and-so's a great kid, probably doesn't really mean that much. So I'm not against people being complimented for other things. But I'm saying, but if we reserved our highest compliments for when our children did kind acts, we'd raise a generation of people who would most love themselves and feel good about themselves when they were doing kind things. That's why it could be so transformative. For years I've gone around and said in speeches, if there's anybody here who has a foundation and is looking for a cause for this foundation, this could be it. If children were raised to get their highest praise for when they acted in a kind way, it could be tremendously transformative. But I want you to know, in the Jewish community, most people don't do that. I made this point to Dennis, and he started going around when he was speaking in high schools, asking kids, what do you think matters most to your parents? And he gave a variety of things, and generally it was academic success, or some sort of, later on professional success. Being an exceptionally good person, they thought was nice, but was not that much of a priority for parents.
I'm wondering if that's also tied in to issues of gratitude. There's a lot of literature today, there's a lot of talk about the generation somehow having lost the trait of gratitude. Perhaps too much is taken for granted, perhaps people have too much. How do we inculcate gratitude in people? And maybe you can outline what you see specifically there is in Judaism that can facilitate that process.
Well, the notion of prayer obviously is rooted in a sense of gratitude, and you're right, it isn't rooted in a sense of entitlement. If somebody takes making brachas seriously, and I'm not a perfect model of it, I try and do it, but I know that I'm inconsistent. But people who really are consistent about brachot are actually making a state every morning. I mean, listen, just by virtue of the fact that I daven every day, you're doing it. What is the very first prayer we make when we get up in the morning? Modani lefanecha. You don't take everything for granted. You're happy and you're grateful that you woke up. So that's a big deal. I remember I was once with Richard Joel. This was years ago when he was the head of Hillel nationally. Richard is now the president of Yeshiva University. And we had made up the night before, we were leaving a conference together, we were going to take a taxi to the airport together. And I remember, so I went into Richard's room to pick him up, and he left some money on the table, which I thought he was forgetting by accident, but he said, no, I left it for the maid. And ever since then, I've been going, not only do I do it all the time, I'm going around, this is great. I said, we're getting into the habit of inculcating gratitude even to those people whose faces we don't see. Because can you imagine if you check into a hotel, a porter brings your luggage up to the room, and you say thank you and then don't tip them? You'd be afraid to go out the front door. But people often don't see the maids. Now, they certainly don't see them when they're checking in or checking out. But I said, but they have done a service for us. Somebody said, well, shouldn't that be included in the price of the hotel room? I said, well, then the porter should also be included. Or I said, or maybe you're under the impression that maids are so highly paid, they would be insulted if you offered them a tip. No, so these things become, relevant. So my children now see me do it, and as a result, they're going to do it because they very much respond to that. But I want to make another point about gratitude, a selfish point about gratitude. This was a point Dennis had made to me when I was writing about gratitude. He says, gratitude is the prerequisite trait for being a happy person. And that's not often thought about, but think about the mindset of a grateful person. Look what so-and-so did for me. He really cares about me. Look how she helped me. She really loves me. At the very moment that you're inculcating, that you're specifying gratitude, you're inculcating a feeling of being loved. Conversely, what's the mindset of an ungrateful person? The only reason he helped me is now I'm going to have to help him. The only reason she spoke to so-and-so on my behalf, now she's going to come to ask me to speak to somebody. So at the very moment that a person is thinking like that, what they're really revealing about themselves is not just an emotional stinginess, but how profoundly unloved they feel. They can't imagine that anybody's doing something for them out of a real sense of love. So this is an example where doing the right thing turns out to be the right thing to do. Because if you really become conscious of gratitude, you're going to change in a certain way. If you become conscious of, you're going to become more aware of how many people love you. Cynics are fools because they tend to think they tend to think everybody has some selfish motive for why they do things. And they're a cause of misery to themselves, and they're a cause of misery to the people around them. They refuse to recognize there are many very good people. And you can choose to focus on what you want to choose to focus, but when you focus on a sense of gratitude and of kindnesses that people do for you, you actually become a happier person. And guess what? Most of us want to be happier. And there are techniques, proven techniques for becoming a happier person. And one of them is becoming a more grateful person. You feel better about yourself. You feel better about the people around you. You feel more loved because you are more loved. It's funny, I remember, it's not the book that's most affected my life, but I remember there was a popular book years ago in the United States, which was thought of as being a little simple. It was called The Power of Positive Thinking. Einstein is reputed to have said, I've never been able to actually find a source, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So Peale, Norman Vincent Peale, who was a minister, I think he was a Methodist, Peale had a suggestion to how to get a little more optimistic in life. And he said, you should for 1 week do the following. One day, only speak using optimistic language. Don't speak cynically, don't be overly realistic, which means don't be overly pessimistic. He says, just speak using hopeful language. Then the next day, go back to speaking your regular realistic language. Then the following day, only optimistic language. Then the next day, realistic, pessimistic language again. He said within a couple of weeks, you will find that even on those days you're being realistic, you're going to end up being more positive. I had occasion to mention, when we were speaking earlier at the school, I didn't mention it to the students, but I asked you that question. One of the things I learned in doing this book on the Rebbe, so I asked you that question. How do you say hospital in Hebrew? Who knows? How do you say hospital in Hebrew? Beit Cholim. Do you know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wouldn't use that word? He said Beit Refuah. He said a house of healing. The word for hospital in Hebrew, Beit Cholim, means house of the sick. He said, why do you want to send somebody to the house of the sick? Why would it occur to anybody, if I get sent to the house of the sick, I'm going to get better? Call it a house of healing. And it reminded me, when I came across that, it reminded me that my mother told me growing up in New York in the 1930s, there was a hospital in New York that was called Home for the Incurables. Can you imagine? Oh yeah, we're transferring you. Where? To the Home for the Incurables. There was such an insensitivity in usage of language. People know that. We know that bedside manner is an important feature in a doctor. And I'll tell you, it can have practical ramifications. I just remembered a story. I won't mention the name because I don't have to cause Lashon Hara. Anyway, I was down in Florida some years ago. I was invited to give a lecture by a family, and the woman told me, by the way, you'll see in tomorrow's Miami, what's the main paper in Miami? I think the Herald. You're going to see that it's announcing a family gift that we made, and as a result of that gift, they were renaming the University of Miami Medical College. And sure enough, the next day, they had given a $100 million gift. But this woman told me the backstory behind the gift. Her husband had been diagnosed with, I forget which, but it was a bad cancer. And he went, this is where I'm not going to mention the name, he went, you'll all know what I'm talking about anyway, he went to the leading cancer place in New York, which is known for being remarkable, but which is also known for having doctors who can be very blunt. I remember once a dear friend of ours was diagnosed with breast cancer. I called up a woman who had worked there. She said, I'll tell you the best doctor in the field there, but you should know he talks in a very harsh way. Anyway, so this woman's husband had gone there when he had gotten this diagnosis, and he met with a leading doctor there. They obviously knew the man was a man of some means. And they met with a leading doctor there, and he said, if I was you, he said, do you like to drink liquor? Man said, yeah. He said, I go home, I drink a lot, and just hang out with your family and do things you like doing. And sent him home with that. This woman told me, my husband came home so depressed. And then they went to the University of Miami. And they discussed with him different treatments. They did things that could maybe prolong his life, but they gave him the feeling that there was hope. You can't take away hope. I remember when I was writing on medical ethics something, I came across a remarkable story. A doctor at a medical school raised the issue, if somebody has a very dire diagnosis, should you tell them? And, most of the students were fudging, but there was one kid who said, if he's going to die, he's going to die soon. You tell him that. You can't go around being overly sentimental. You have to tell the truth. The doctor got angry at the student. He said, you're unfit to be a doctor. I want you to go to the dean of the college, and I want you to tell him that I want you expelled from the college. The student was shocked. But he said, I mean it. Get out of the room and go to the dean and tell him that I want you expelled. So the student started walking out the door. The doctor said, you can come back now. I just wanted you to know what it's like when somebody tells you your whole life is over. Your whole situation is destroyed. So this woman told me that's what they ended up giving the $100 million. You can't take away hope from people. And we have to learn to use language of hope. And, this becomes very, very significant. Yes?
I just, I would like to open it up to the floor. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then if people have questions, they should think of it now and come up, and we'll have a little bit of a question period. So I'm just cueing you to that. I didn't put it on the list, but I was so struck by the question you were asked this afternoon at the school and your answer that I want to see if we can repeat that again. At the end of the time that Rabbi Telushkin was at high school, a student asked him very simply, but I thought very powerfully, please tell me what it means to be holy. And I'd like you to share with our audience what you said.
I must have been channeling God's will at that moment. What did I say? I don't. No, basically, what I answered was, holiness comes about when we recognize in others that they are also in the image of God. And it's the problem with teachings that get repeated is that they run the risk of becoming cliches. The truth is, cliches became cliches because they were often true. But once they become cliches, they lose their freshness. But the real bottom line is, when we confront other people, we have to recognize in them the image of God. Because can you imagine anybody doing an act of violence if they saw the other person as an image of God? Aren't all acts of violence preceded by the dehumanization of the other person? And so, just keeping that in mind, that the people you are dealing with are like you, as real as you, and as much in God's image as you, we will treat them in such a way that it will reflect holiness in our lives. I'll give you one other, maybe we'll take some questions, and then I have one other teaching I want to conclude with. But you remember well, you heard me. Did I make any other point there?
You did.
What else did I say? No, listen, I want to...
I had it while you were talking, and it's sliding out now. You definitely talked about the idea of violence. The exercise. That's what you said. from one 24-hour period to the next. You want me to keep
Oh,
going?
yes. Okay, yeah, that was another, yes. Hillel's teaching, Da'alech Hasani, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto others. I want to urge you, it's now 9:15, to go until 9:15 tomorrow for one day just to try and practice that. The point I was making is people sometimes ask, why didn't Hillel just simply say, love your neighbor as yourself? 100 years after Hillel, Akiva did say that. He summarized Judaism. He said, "Yehavta kamocha zeh klal gadol b'Torah." Love your neighbors yourself. This is the major principle of the Torah. So there was a tradition of summarizing Judaism with biblical verses, but Hillel's was not a biblical verse. He obviously had come up with an innovative teaching, and he phrased it in the negative, what's hateful unto you. And the reason is, I think love your neighbor as yourself, it's hard to know exactly what does it mean. Does it mean that if somebody very poor is your neighbor, you should split your assets with him? Understood literally, the verse seems to suggest that, but none of us are going to do it. You know, so it can demand from us standards that don't really resonate with us. But we all know things we don't like, and we want to refrain from doing to other people things that they don't like. So what would it be like to go for a day and do that for the next 24 hours?
So if people have questions, they should line up at the front and we'll pass along the mic. I, for one, am going to ask one more while you're collecting yourselves. We're 2 weeks away from Rosh Hashanah. And if there's one Joseph Telushkin book that you think people could benefit from reading prior to these holidays or on the holidays themselves, which would it be and why?
Well, different people at different levels of knowledge, I think, you know, would find that they would resonate with different books. So that, for example, in the first volume of my Code of Jewish Ethics, I have specific sections dealing with laws of repentance, dealing with laws of repentance and forgiveness. As a general book for the year, my Book of Jewish Values offers one ethical teaching for every day of the year. So, you know, those would strike me as good starting points.
Have your different writing styles between you and Dennis Prager,
Right.
and I wanted to know if there are any beliefs that you differ with Dennis, and where do you two differ?
Okay.
Rabbi Telushkin, in your recent book, Code of Jewish Ethics, you discuss love thy neighbor as thyself, and you extend the reachel to non-Jews. And I wonder how you do that when, according to the Gemara, Sefer Chinuch and Rambam, reachel means only a fellow Jew. And how do you relate this to the two mitzvahs, lo sameit al dam reachel, that you're not supposed to stand idly by when somebody's in danger? How do we then save a non-Jew when reachel means only a fellow Jew? And the other thing is with the mitzvah of not speaking Lashon Hara. Does that mean only you're not supposed to speak against a fellow Jew Lashon Hara, or even a non-Jew?
Okay, thank you.
Rabbi Telushkin, really my question is similar to the first question. Over the years, I've seen Dennis Prager veer very much away from halacha, from normative halacha, and while you embraced halacha as essential for continuity, I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay. Yeah.
You had made the comment that earlier in your life, your relationship was more with ritual and studying, and only later your relationship with God evolved. I was wondering if you could comment further on the evolution of your relationship with Hashem.
Okay. Dennis is my closest friend, but it's weird. I don't want to start having to defend his behavior. Let him do it. Dennis's politics are more conservative than mine, but in fundamental issues, we basically agree. What we disagree sometimes on how to apply them. Dennis and I evolved early on in our lives a fairly similar view of human nature. How did it happen we evolved it? Because we would argue about things, and usually one or the other of us would convince the other. And the rationale for the halachic system that we evolved was largely based on a very sober view of human nature, based on a pasuk in Bereshis, Perek Chet, Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minu rav. The tendency of man's heart is towards evil from his youth. This doesn't mean people are born bad. It means they're born morally neutral with strong tendencies towards selfishness. If people were born good, so you would go into a house and you see a mother yelling at her 3-year-old son, "Johnny, stop being so selfless," and giving all your toys away to the other children. Kids have to be educated towards generosity. Now, the prevailing presumption in the Western world since the time of Rousseau and the men of the Enlightenment has been that people are born good and corrupted by society. I think that's been a very destructive belief, because people then have a tendency to look outside themselves for the causes of bad things. Jews in particular tend to be obsessed with politics, tend to think if we only change the political system, things will be better. So many Jews at one time were socialists, and many secular Jews were communists. And they were convinced, could there be anything worse than the Tsar? Yeah. History showed us there could be much worse things than the Tsar. The most important thing about a system is that human beings take responsibility for themselves. Dennis applies it in certain ways, and his politics, as I said, but I don't really want to get into a discussion of it because it's weird. I'll then start asking you about every area of your friends that you disagree with. Dennis can defend himself. Okay, the issue of love your neighbor as yourself as it applies to non-Jews. There are 3 laws of love in the Torah. One, first of all, if you want to go, I'll go on what. There are 3 laws of love in the Torah. The most famous, there are 2 that are the 2 most famous because they're equally famous. One is love your neighbor as yourself, and the second is, and you shall love the Lord your God. Which is because we all know it because it's in the Shema. The third is less known. What is the third law of love in the Torah? It's in Vayikra, it's in the same parak as V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It's V'ahavta et hager. How you shall love the stranger. Okay, now here we run into a halachic argument. What does the word ger mean? The word ger, by the time of the Talmud, meant convert to Judaism. So this law would seem to mean that there was a law of love your neighbor as yourself and an additional law of love the convert. In other words, converts should be doubly loved. I question that interpretation for the following reason. The word ger in the Torah seems to mean stranger, because Jews are told, treat the ger well, because gerim hayitem, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Or does it mean treat the convert well because you were converts in the land of Egypt, which doesn't seem to make sense. It seems to me that the Jewish attitude of love towards Jews and the Jewish attitude of love towards non-Jews has the following distinction. Love within the Jewish community is assumed to be more similar to familial love. How many of you have a sibling or a cousin who, if they were not your sibling or your cousin, you probably wouldn't be close to, maybe at all? Okay. I have a feeling it might even be a few more than those who raise their hands. But because of familial feelings, you act in a certain way that's not fully rational. I always try and reconcile people who are siblings, and one of the ways I do it is I say to them, I cannot think of a greater act of disrespect to your parents than not getting along at some level with your siblings. I have 4 children. If I knew that someday 2 of my children were not on speaking terms, it would break my heart. So when it comes to non-Jews, I think there is a more rational basis for it. It is a response to non-Jews. There are edicts in the Talmud, there are teachings in the Talmud that I don't think would apply. I'll give you another example to the gentleman who asked the question. Yeah. Do you know that there are many figures within the halachic world who interpreted reacha as only meaning somebody who is an observant Jew? Reacha meant somebody who was amitcha, who was your partner in the keeping of mitzvot. I wonder, would you do that? Where would we draw the line? So if we live in a society of great openness to non-Jews, we have to start thinking about it. Every year, the Federation movement in the United States raises about $1 billion, sends an enormous amount of money to Israel. Every year, the American government sends 3 times that amount of money to Israel. Should there be no recognition of that? Should non-Jews, and first of all, if you really feel that you're living in a society where the non-Jews amongst whom you live should not be entitled to a feeling of love from you, So why would you even want to live in such a society? You know, why would you want to make known? Do you know that there are Jews who believe you shouldn't be mechalel Shabbos, you shouldn't violate the Shabbos to save a non-Jewish life? They believe that that's what God wants. They believe that God considers your observance of the Sabbath to be more important than saving the life of somebody who's collapsed on the street, who you could drive to a hospital. Doesn't seem like a very loving God. Is there any evidence that God does not believe that non-Jews are created in God's image? So, you know, why? I mean, why would we want to do that or teach that? Lashon Hara should have a reciprocal basis too. It's not great. I assure you, Jews who've been raised to feel that it's okay to treat non-Jews in business, you really want to do business with those people? You really think they're going to be so great to you? I don't think so. So, you know, so that's what I said. There are areas in which you can pick answers out of Jewish law, but you have to, somebody once said to me, I remember I was early in my life, I was giving a speech somewhere, and somebody said to me, you know, when I got disgusted with Judaism, I was in the 6th grade, and my teacher told me that if a non-Jew loses an item, or you don't have to return it to him, or if he makes an error in a business deal and you don't have to correct it. And I said to him, did your teacher also teach you that it's permitted to eat pork on Yom Kippur? He said, of course not. I said, yes, but in a concentration camp it would be permitted. Many Jews didn't, but it would have been permitted. But for me to say it's permitted to eat pork on Yom Kippur without giving the very specific historical circumstance turns me into a trickster. If you say a Jew doesn't have to return a lost item to a non-Jew, that it's taught like that in the Talmud, but it was taught in the context of a society where non-Jews didn't return lost objects to Jews. But to imagine that a Rabbi Akiva would have said, and even if someday there is a non-Jewish society in which non-Jews are told to treat Jews equally, even there we should keep lost items of non-Jews. I remember I was writing about this in one of my books, and literally while I was writing about it, it was late at night on a Saturday morning. It was 1:30 in the morning. It was actually Sunday morning. I don't want to make it sound like I was being Machal Shabbos. It was Sunday morning at 1:30 in the morning. Devorah and I are getting out of a taxi, and suddenly we see a wallet's been left in the taxi. So we take it with us. We didn't want to just give it to the driver. We didn't know what would happen. We go upstairs, and we find the name of the girl whose wallet it is. So I call up information, and lo and behold, her name is listed in information, and it's 1:30 in the morning. Devorah says it's late. I said, I assure you, this woman is going crazy right now. So we call up her phone number, and it's one of the only times it's happened to me in recent years. The phone rings and rings, and she doesn't have an answering machine. So then I look for more things in her wallet, and I see a card, like a lawyer's card with the same last name as hers. And I could see from her driver's license, she looked like a young woman, so I figured it's probably her father. Again, Devorah says, it was in Florida, you want to call at 1:30 in the morning? I said, yeah, let's call. So we call, we get an answering machine, and I leave the message, and within 10 minutes I get a call back, and then I immediately call the girl. She is sobbing. She felt her life had come to an end. She was a 26-year-old young woman who had recently moved to New York, and if any of you have ever had your wallet picked or lost all of your cards, it's not the money, obviously, that drives you crazy. It's your whole life is out of bounds. She came to our house. She was crying. She was so grateful. And I thought, could you imagine if somebody had taken this and said, she clearly had a non-Jewish name, and said, I don't have to return it to her. You know, you trust how that person is going to treat Jews. It's a good thing to be a good person. And it's a good thing to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim. And I'll tell you a story I came across, and this I'll conclude now finally with this. I've been reading through hundreds of interviews about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because I'm writing a book on him. And one of the interviews I came across was with a guy named David Lukens, who was very politically active, worked for Senator Moynihan. And he was present when Shirley Chisholm, who was a congresswoman from Brooklyn, Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman who was elected. I think the first woman in history had been elected to Congress. And it was in the mid-60s, at a time when a lot of congressional committees were still controlled by Democrats from the South. So she had made it known, she was from Brooklyn, that she wanted to be on the housing committee to help, bring better housing to New York. And they, who wanted to basically not help her in any way, they put her on the agriculture committee, which prompted one newspaper in New York to headline this story, "A Tree Grows in Brooklyn." What was she going to do? Anyway, so when she retired from Congress years later, Lukens was at a breakfast she sponsored, and she said she got a phone call from the office of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because she happened to represent the district of Chabad, and was told the Rebbe would like to see you. And she knew that that this was a substantial constituency, most of whom voted. So she comes into the Rebbe's office, and the Rebbe says to her, "You're on the agriculture committee. It's known that an excessive amount of produce is grown every year in the United States. Isn't there a program that they've just started, which was very small at the time, called the Food Stamps Program? Isn't this an opportunity that you've been given by God to help provide more food to poor people?" And she actually, in the speech, credited the Rebbe as the one who put that thought into her head. And she then went to Bob Dole, who was a Republican senator, but who came from Kansas and was very concerned both with his farmers and ended up being very concerned also with the issue of food for people. So I'm saying we're at our most glorious moment. I'm not saying throwing our love on people who hate us, but there are a lot of people out there who don't hate us. And it's remarkable. When I lived in Israel, Israelis would sometimes say to me, "You American Jews, you're naive. You think you're the first Jews in history who ever were emancipated?" And I thought about it, and they were right. French Jews had been emancipated, German Jews had been emancipated, but I realized that my answer to their question was, we aren't the first Jews in history to be emancipated, but we're the first Jews to live in a society where Judaism has been emancipated. When Jews lived in Europe, even when they got equal rights, Judaism was so looked down upon. Let me ask you a question. How many of you know 2 or more non-Jews who converted to Judaism? So the large majority of hands. How many of you know 2 or more Jews who become Christians? Very few hands. Okay. If we were in Europe 100 years ago and I said, how many of you know 2 or more non-Jews who converted to Judaism, you would have looked at me as if I was a madman. Nobody converted to Judaism. And if I said, how many of you know 2 or more Jews who become Christians, you say 2, I know 20. Judaism got emancipated. I was a high school student in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was nominated to be the Republican candidate for the presidency. And as Harry Goldman said at the time, I always knew that the first Jew nominated for president would be an Episcopalian. Because Goldwater's father and grandfather had been a Goldwasser, but the family had converted. Had anybody told us in high school in 1964 that in 2000 a Jew would be nominated for a national party office in the United States, we would have assumed it would be what we used to call a 3-day-a-year Jew. Somebody went to shul once on Rosh Hashanah, once on Yom Kippur, and attended a Seder. Had somebody said, no, a Jew's going to be nominated for vice president who won't campaign on Saturday because it's Shabbos, it would have sounded crazy. But it was actually considered an asset to Lieberman. And Lieberman's still a senator, and just this week he published a book called The Day of Rest on the role Shabbat has played in his life. Guess what? We're living in societies that call forth different responses from the responses that we often had when we lived in very different sorts of societies. And I think that's a good thing. And I think most of us hope that we want to help build that spirit. Thank you. Oh, wait, I said I wanted to conclude. Could I conclude with one teaching?
Well, yeah, you're going to conclude with teaching, I guess, Rabbi, and we're going to ask Rabbi Kanofsky to conclude. So.
Okay, so this is my last teaching because it's become longer than we wanted. Hillel is famous for saying, Imein ani li mili, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? V'im ani uksha'ani la'atzmi mani, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? And what's the conclusion? Which in English is? If not now, when? We often think of if not now, when is actually one of the relatively few Talmudic teachings that's become fairly well known in the non-Jewish world. And I've seen it used by high-level political figures when there's been some sort of an economic policy. So it's often associated with the macro issues. Since Rosh Hashanah is coming up, I want to take 30 seconds, and I want quiet. If we were Quakers, we would be for about 15 minutes, but in the Jewish community, 30 seconds. And I want everybody to think in some area in your own life where, if not now, when applies. Not a macro issue, not a big political issue, but in some area in your own life, I just want us to think for 30 seconds where, if not now, when applies. Maybe it'll cause us to change, maybe it won't, but it'll at least keep our minds focused on something different we could do. Let's start now. I want to thank you all for participating, and I just want to thank Elliot for what was so far and away in my life the best interview anyone has ever done with me. I've seldom been with a person who I feel was so attuned to what my thinking was and what my concerns were. It made me a little nervous, but no, actually, I am very, very grateful to you. This was a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Good evening, folks. My name is Joe Kanofsky. I'm the rabbi here at Kehillat Shari Torah. I want to thank you all for coming this evening to be here with us for this special program. I hope you'll come again. I want to thank Rabbi Telushkin for his encouraging and uplifting and warm words. I don't know if you can think of the last time that you heard a rabbi speak for an hour and you stayed awake for the whole time, but I think we can be grateful to him for that. Thanks to Dr. Malamuth and to Rabbi Kelman and to their staff for bringing this outstanding program to our shul this evening. Also, just like to say a quick word of thanks to our excellent leadership at KST, our president, Daryl Bieber, and our office staff, Alan Dome, for their efforts. A quick mention of the sponsors of this evening's program, Pam and Ian Rosemarin and family, and the Luft family, in memory, as we heard before, of Marcus Luft, Zichrono Livracha, a very dear member of our congregation who passed away earlier this year and is very much missed. Just a quick commercial. I know that some people will have a withdrawal if we have a whole evening without a quick commercial. In our shul in KST, we have a reading circle that meets on more or less a monthly basis and discusses an important book of Jewish interest. Long before this program was planned, we had decided that this year's book would be Jewish Literacy, Rabbi Telushkin's book, Jewish Literacy. I think in the latest edition there are probably 400 and something essays. 350 essays. So we'll do a couple a month. We're hoping in 80 or 90 years to make our way through. Result 11.
I'll come back for the
Oh, for the Siyum. We'll be back to the Siyum. Excellent. If you would like to be part of that, please get in touch with us here at the shul, in the office. We would love to have you be part of that. I'm sure it'll be a fascinating conversation. I'd like to invite everyone downstairs for a cup of tea and a cookie, and wish you all a ksira v'chsima tova, a good gebench jor, happy and healthy and sweet year, and thanks again for coming.